Hello, John. Thank you for coming back to the channel here. This is episode 18, and I want to remind the audience that in the description of this video and all the videos I've done with John, there's a link that you can click that will take you to his website. So please click that link, take a look at the website, sign up for the periodical. He also does individual readings. We'll go in a little bit more detail about that throughout the show, but offline, I was talking to John a little bit about Taiwan and my sense of a ramp up of activity, maybe this year, maybe next year. So maybe if you want to start with that, you can go anywhere you want, John. You know how the
Well,
show goes.
yeah, and how I go. Let's put
Right,
it that way.
right.
We are in World War III. It is not a Cold War anymore. It hasn't been since 2022 February, when the first front erupted, the proxy NATO war using Ukraine to the last Ukrainian to try to break up Russia, which it can't do. That was the first front. It's important to understand, one of the best ways to look at why the whole argument, when does a world war begin? A great show I suggest people watch is this show that for like almost 6 years now, every week they do all that happened in 1 week of World War II. And it's called World War II Week by Week with it's, you just type that in, you'll find it. And so I fortunately didn't have to wait for it all those years. I came into it like 2/3 of the way in, so I got to just binge watch all of them for most of them, except for the end of 43 into 45, which I had to do weekly. But I learned a lot about how, we think of a world war, you think the whole world is fighting. There's everybody's fighting everywhere. But if you do it week by week, even World War One, most of the world is not even involved for a long, long time. Uh, I mean, to give you an example, in World War II started in with the Nazi invasion of Poland and the Soviet occupation of Eastern Poland. And so that was like the first shot. And then there was some things happening in the Atlantic with pocket ships, battleships, and things like that, and some of the sinkings there. But then there was a whole long period where there was not much anything was called a sitzkrieg rather than a blitzkrieg. Rather from lightning war, it became sitting war, where after the end of September when Poland fell, there was this long, long period where nothing happened in Europe, and the French were just waiting on the Siegfried Line for the Germans to do something. Then the next flare-up, so these flare-ups, the next flare-up was in Finland, fighting the Soviet Union. So that was so you have a separate war there. You have a separate war there and the other place. You have some things going on in the Pacific. You have nothing going on, I mean, sorry, in the Atlantic, and you have nothing going on in the Pacific yet, except that actually you could claim, maybe it's a little Western bias, but frankly, I would claim that World War II started in 1937 when the Japanese made their full-scale invasion of China, which ended up killing 20 million Chinese in World War II. So as far as I'm concerned, World War II started with the Shanghai bombings and the Japanese taking Shanghai and then Nanking and all of that. And it was big, millions of folks and stuff fighting in China. But we have this Western bias where you hardly find information on what was one of the second largest theater of World War II. The first being the Soviet Union and Germany, second being China. When you look at men and material, millions of people fighting. Um, so so anyway, so it goes on, and then suddenly it flares up more in Europe in the May. Well, there was a little stuff in Norway. The Finns lost by March of 1940, and then another flare up. That all's over, and then another flare up happens in Norway, with the Nazis occupying Norway and Denmark, and then the British and the French trying to do an expedition there in April of 1940. And then, of course, that all got kind of put on the sideline and everybody left because then the Battle of France started with the Nazis doing a surprise attack through the Ardennes forest, which, by the way, Nostradamus foresaw. He said a great empire would fall in the Ardennes forest, the Sylve d'Ardennes. He actually named it outright. And then another would fall. So it was like two empires would fall there. Well, the first was the Battle of France, was won by the Germans by the surprise attack, broke through the ranks. All the British BAF people and the French armies had gone to fight in Belgium, and then they went behind them all the way to Dunkirk and surrounded the BEF, and you have the famous ship's landing of Dunkirk. So it's getting big. It's getting big, but it's mostly just in Europe. And then it kind of wanders out of when France falls, you have the Battle of Britain for a few months, and then the 6 months of the Blitz. So these are very kind of individual things. It's like this and that's gone. Now there's this, now there's that. And then there was the whole when the Italians suffered in North Africa, then suddenly North Africa became an issue where the Germans had to save Mussolini's troops. So now suddenly all of that is raging in North Africa. And then there's a coup in Serbia and Yugoslavia, that is, and then the Germans came in to take that out. So suddenly now there's fighting in the Eastern Balkans and the Central Balkans. And then that stops. And then there's fighting in Greece and Crete and the paratroopers coming in. So that's all going on. And then that stops. So it's not like a whole world at war. And then finally, we're into 1941 before it's even being called a world war. And that's because of the vast German offensive Operation Barbarossa, which was the 3 million Germans on a 1,000-mile front invaded the Soviet Union. And that was a titanic. That's the first time it really became a titanic battle. I mean, the whole Battle of France would have just been one battle on the Eastern Front in even the first year of Operation Barbarossa, which ended up with the greatest battle in history, the Battle of Moscow, that nobody talks about on either side because both sides lost so many. Stalin didn't want to talk about it. Hitler didn't want to talk about it, but it was the biggest battle in history around Moscow. 600-mile front, 7 million people, soldiers engaged, 600,000 Nazi casualties, 2 million Soviet casualties, prisoners, wounded, killed. Biggest battle in the world. Everybody talks about Stalingrad and Kursk, but they were very much smaller than that. Even less significant than the great encirclements at Kiev and later at the beginning of the Battle of Moscow, which literally had 1.2 million Soviets surrender and 500,000 killed and wounded. Unheard of losses in military history. And yet the Russians just kept building more armies and moved 600 factories over the Urals, had them set up without any buildings over them. They were making tanks in the snow. And so titanic, epic battles. So towards the end of 41, when you add the Pacific Theater with the Japanese attacking Pearl Harbor, that's when it became. And then Hitler idiotically declared war on the United States. He didn't have to. The Axis Treaty did not allow, if somebody did a unilateral attack, that the other people in the triumvirate had to get involved, Italy and Germany. So, but he decided to turn it into a world war, which he couldn't win. So 1939, 40, 41. So the first 3 years, people weren't calling it World War. It was a European war, a new European war. Oh my God. No, it was, but this is how world wars are fought. And so the same pattern is happening now, folks. It's happening. You could technically say that the preliminary hostilities of World War III started when the Americans decided to overthrow the democratically elected President Yanukovych of Ukraine and replace him with a hand-picked people of neo-Nazis and fascists who wanted to ethnically cleanse 40% of Ukraine's people, which are ethnic Russians. And they tried to, and there was a big fight, and it ended up being a civil war for 8 years. And then finally, when the Ukrainians, with NATO's help, NATO was already involved. NATO was already for 8 years training the Ukrainian army, turning it into a de facto NATO unit. It was the largest army of NATO, unofficially. They helped them build the trench lines and defense lines that are currently being fought in now. So NATO was involved by 2014 on, 2015 for sure on. And so so already things are brewing. It's whether you want to start back in 2014 or you want to start in 2022 when the Ukrainians, when their army was ready, were going to ethnically cleanse the Donbass, Lugansk and Donetsk, Russian-speaking provinces of Ukraine, which wanted to leave all this. I mean, why would you want to be part of Ukraine when the majority wants to kill you for your land, for your industries? I mean, I've watched hundreds of hours of people being interviewed by Patrick Lancaster, a great American reporter on the scene since 2014, and still reporting. Thank God he's not dead yet. Hope it never happens. He's been some close. He's a war correspondent. He married a Russian. He has kids. He lives in Donbass and Donetsk, and I have seen hundreds of hours where he's interviewing people saying, "What, why do you think the Ukrainians are shooting at you? What's this all?" And whether they're young, old, these people, they go, we live peacefully with Ukrainians, and then one day they had this new government where they suddenly said, "We don't want you here, and if we can't ethnically cleanse you out of this area, we'll bury you 6 feet under in Ukraine." And they said, they don't want us. They don't want us to be back in their country. They want us out. And then they want it, one of the heaviest industrial areas of Ukraine is the Donbass region. Um, so uh, finally, the Russians and Putin, he was trying to peacefully end this thing from becoming a war. When people say he went in to invade, no, he had been provoked for years. The Russians had been provoked. And millions of the Donbass people they had to camp out and take care of. Now, if any of you remember in South Asia, there in 1971, there was a Indo-Pakistani war, which started because of the eruption of a revolution for independence of East Pakistan from West Pakistan. There was a time when you'd have the Indian subcontinent here, and you'd have East Pakistan, West Pakistan, and they were completely different cultures. It was one of the weird things they did when they partitioned India. They divided these two people with 1,500 miles between them in a massive India. And the Bangladeshis, the West Bangladeshis, Western Bengal were part of this, and they rebelled because they're being persecuted by the Western Pakistanis. And what then happened was that 300,000 people were massacred, and millions of Bangladeshis started to crowd into India. And Indira Gandhi, who was the prime minister, said, "We can't take these people. It'll collapse our country. We can't handle this sudden influx of 8 to 10 million people." So they threatened Islamabad in West Pakistan, "Stop this war or we will have to finish it." And they got in the war on the side of the Bangladeshis, and Bangladesh was made independent. People could go home. Well, Russia is in the same situation for 8 years. They had 1.3 million people they had to take care of. There were millions of Ukrainians that, we all hear about the Ukrainians going west, but there were millions that also felt to move with the Russian sphere, because for hundreds of years, Russians and Ukrainians were peacefully living together. They're virtually the same people. And so finally, but still, to a fault, Vladimir Putin and the Russian government tried to stop this becoming a wider war. But finally, even he said, "I should have done this sooner." He was very adverse to going to war. What you hear in the press is BS. If you just have to look at Hogue prophecy reports and other people in alternative media like myself that you can see him saying it. You can see in what year he said it. And you will never see that in the Western media because it doesn't follow the propaganda. And, I can prove my side. You go to your Western media, they can't prove what they're saying. And if you go read New York Times, you will, I always tell people, if you want to read the New York Times and really find out what's happening, don't ignore the back page, the front pages, go all the way back to the corrections, and then you'll find to what length these people have lost the sense of journalism over the last decades. Where they have to correct all these stories that they concocted that has no proof. So it's not the New York Times that I grew up with. So you have all of this going on, and what then happened is the Ukrainians, and I was even reporting on, I was seeing how they were lining up for, mixed operations and getting ready to make a push. They almost went in April of the year before, 2021. But the Russians amassed a whole lot of people at the border very quickly. No one expected they could do that across 11 time zones. And they had them there within 2 weeks. They had like 200,000 people on the other side of the Donbass. And then so the Ukrainians backed off. But all they did is they continued to arm and train and swell their numbers until they were getting ready for this big push in the dead of winter. And they began the artillery barrages in the week of February 20, and it was a major artillery barrage, the OSCE, which were the people monitoring this. I had put up the maps where they weren't pro-Russian, but they had to admit that all the shelling was coming from the Ukrainians across the Donbass region as a softening up for a major offensive, which, by the way, was planned for the 10th of March. The leaders of Donbass and Lugansk went to Russia and Duma and the parliament of Russia, and they made their case and say, look, we want to be part of Russia. They're going to ethnically cleanse us with this invasion. And it'd be Bangladesh all over again. Millions more would go into Russia, homeless, hungry, traumatized. Fellow Russians, Russia had tried for a long, long time to avoid this. But it's like Vladimir Putin once said about this whole thing. And he admitted openly his mistakes. He does that a lot, by the way. You'll never see Biden or cackling Kamala or even Trump ever admit their mistakes. But he openly said, I was naive. I thought I could negotiate with the Europeans, and because he's very pro-Europe. He loved Germany. He did not want to sever this connection between Russian Federation and Europe, but the Europeans didn't want to work with it. They wanted to break Russia up, just like Napoleon, just like Hitler, just like all the other European conquerors that have tried to steal the resources and divide the people of all the Russias. And when even Ukraine was a part of it. People forget that about 9 million Ukrainians of the 27.5 million in World War II died under Hitler's tyranny. So then what happens is, so these people, the Russians then invaded on the 24th of February with an army of 45,000 people. Now, and then they went way in, they took a whole lot of territory. There was no Ukrainian armed forces in Kherson and these other Russian-speaking areas. They went in there, and they basically took it without a shot. And then, because the whole ruse was, you don't invade Ukraine. You're not going to occupy Ukraine with 45,000 people and a few hundred tanks. They were trying to shock the Ukrainians to talk. It worked. By the beginning of March, the Ukrainians were suing for some diplomatic solution to end this problem. They went to Turkey over Erdogan's was the president of Turkey overseeing in I think it was Istanbul, not Ankara, the peace talks to end this. And they, by end of March, the Ukrainians and Putin and the Russians had a deal, had signed. They signed on to it as a preliminarily finished, like all the hard work was done. They were going to sign it at the beginning of April, and then NATO and the deep state sent in Boris Johnson, the prime minister then of Britain, to go to President Zelensky of Ukraine and say, rip up the treaty. We don't want peace. And he ripped up the treaty. And because of that, 600,000 Ukrainians are dead, 1 million injured, the infrastructure is destroyed. This war became a big war. And all this shenanigans since 2014 of NATO trying to bring Ukraine into, like, here's the point that gets overlooked. It's so important. I mean, World War III literally started because of this. The Russians are completely against Ukraine being part of NATO because since 1990, when the Cold War ended, the promises that were made by the West to Russia that NATO would not advance all the way to Russia's borders was written down, folks. It was real. Secretary Baker of the Bush Senior series is still alive of his presidency. He can still tell you, even though he's in his 90s, that's and was talking all the time about, yeah, we did that. That was the agreement. Now, Gorbachev was naive to a fault. The premier of Russia, the final premier of the Soviet Union, he was a very naive man and gullible, and he should have had that officially written as a treaty. But what then happened is, especially after Bush honored the treaty and honored the promise, but by the time the Clinton administration came into power and neoconservatives started to rise in both parties, the decision was to march all to take what used to be the Warsaw Pact of the Cold War and convert them all, most of them, into an expanded NATO. Because NATO was looking for a reason to be, and even though they deny it until it's blue in their faces, the reason they exist is to destroy Russia and break it up. And now they're admitting it. And so over the years from 1990 up through into the new century, the NATO was adding more nations, more armies to its alliance, getting more militarily powerful, and literally planting themselves in the Balkans, right on the Russian border, and in Romania, right on the Russian border. And now they wanted Ukraine, which, if you understand history, Ukraine has always been the soft underbelly of all Russian history. That's where invasions from the West, which often come to rape and pillage the resources and the people of Russia, come through Ukraine. So in 2007, Vladimir Putin went to the Munich Security Conference of that year and made his famous speech where he said, we know what you're doing. We had these promises. You've broken them all. You're encroaching upon our frontiers, just like Hitler, just like Napoleon, just like Charles XII, just like the Knights of the Teutonic Order in 1280 something. We know what you're doing, and we feel threatened. We feel that you're getting ready. I mean, look, what would you all do if Russia had made a treaty with Canada to make it part of Russia's union and put 1 million people on our Northern American border? Oh no, we're not there. We're not there to do. We're a peaceful defensive organization, even though you look over the border and there they are all arrayed, just like Hitler said, oh no, we're not, we're just doing maneuvers in 1941. We're not going to break our treaty with Stalin and all that, the German Soviet non-aggression treaty. No, we're not going to do that. We're just doing maneuvers. And then they attack, kill 27 million Russians. We Americans may not remember our history from yesterday, but the Russian people, the Chinese people, they remember their history. They have context. We don't give a damn about context. So we don't know. We make decisions not knowing. We project upon our enemy our isolationist view of them to our disastrous future and the future of the world. So finally, the Russians do not love war. They don't have a war for profit business. They have a war business that's owned by the state to defend Russia from not losing another 27.5 million people from Europeans. They don't want to be a part of Europe anymore. They are a third of Europe, a third of European culture, comes from Russia. But the rest of Europe has decided to turn them into an object to keep NATO alive and keep the warmongering industry alive, not resolving to any peaceful solution because, friends, that is bad for war business. I mean, NATO and the West has become addicted to war. The drug of the money that's being made, it's about the only thing that America manufactures anymore. And to have wars, you have to constantly have tension, toxicity, projections on others, a militarized dollar, sanctions. This is psychotic. Our government and our war industry cannot function if peace is allowed to happen on Earth. So it's the problem. But Russia does have a big army because they have a big land to defend, but they have no interest in invading us. But anyway, so that's backstory. I mean, I'm trying not only just to give you the bigger picture of World War III, but to understand how this war, more than most, has one side completely unaware of what they're doing with the other side because they don't give a damn about knowing who the Russians. I mean, I ask you all here, you Americans are watching this, do you really give a damn about what really is going on in Russia, or you just listen to CNN and Fox and the legacy networks tell you what they say is happening and you just blink and nod and go along with it? I doubt you are here because you wouldn't be watching Paul Cottrell and me right now. So I'm just putting that out that there are millions and millions of Americans who just don't know. It's not even a question of not caring. They just don't know, and they don't want to know. They're too busy with their little lives. They don't understand the big picture because, frankly, the education of this country has gotten so bad since I have been alive. I've watched it. I'm in October 29th. I'm going to begin entering my 70th year. And I've seen a lot of history. I've seen this country change. And I've seen its education systems go down, its civics classes going down. And I've always said the Antichrist's name is dumb or stupid with a capital D or S. So,
Let me tell you, can I just
go ahead.
interject? I saw a research paper that was published in 2022, and it did an analysis of actually average IQs in different countries. The United States has an IQ of the average IQ in the United States as of 2022 was 98. I mean, it's crazy. It's below average.
Yeah,
The average person in the
nation of
United
retards.
States is below. Yeah. And
Yeah,
so,
it's okay.
and so
Sorry.
even
Sorry,
if,
folks, if you're upset.
yeah,
You
yeah,
have a nation of retards.
yeah. No, and that's the thing is that, the sad thing is you may have in a society, individuals, a certain percentage, a small percentage that are above average, but what happens is that with the collective, it just brings it all down. I mean, even if you have just a small assembly of people, let's say 10% have above average, and then the 90% of them are at 98 IQ. All right, just the whole group that has assembled, that group IQ just goes low, even if you have some people in the group that have high IQs. So I just, everything is like, it goes to the lowest common denominator, and I'm looking at I'm looking at situations in the last 5 years or so, and I'll tell you, I think it's a big problem, John.
Oh,
I think
it is
I
the
think
problem.
the educational system is faulty. I blame it on these
Yeah.
devices. The smartphones turned us into dumb people,
Do you know
and
what's funny about that? You know what's funny about that is, conversely, I've done a lot of study on this. Conversely, after all these years that I've been looking at what's going on in the Donbass and in Russia, and even appearing on Russian television, I was filmed here in America, but they showed um, my documentaries where I talked about Edgar Casey's prophecy about Russia being the hope of the world that he did in 1944, and to 64 million Russians one night. And that was in the last day of 2017 on Channel 1, their main channel. The Russians' IQ, the old idea, oh, the big dumb Russian bears are big dumb people that can't do anything. No, you're projecting, America. You are the big dumb people. You're dumb enough to let the Israeli lobby of AIPAC buy your congressman and your Senate and give $10 million to your president over his long career, where he becomes somehow a millionaire on a senator's yearly wage. Well, 5 to 10 million of that was AIPAC, the Jewish lobby, which is not registered as a foreign agent. But I mean, if you want to see how I challenge all of you to go listen to Bibi Netanyahu's speech before the assembled masses of the House and the Senate in the House of Representatives. Watch the whole thing. Watch all these clapping seals. Everything he said was they were 58 times they stopped him. And at one point he got very rude and said, "Stop clapping." And they all went, "Who is this foreigner telling Americans in the people's house, on the people's podium, what to do?" That's not what a guest does. You don't have Winston Churchill coming into that same body and barking commands to the legislator at the beginning of World War II, and he came and visited in 1942. Not at all. Guests don't do that. People own you do. And if you look at the amounts of money that all those clapping seals get from AIPAC, if you look at the real problem we have here, and it should be changed law, if you are working in the government, if you are working in the state of this America, you cannot have dual citizenship. Because if you do, now you can have dual citizenship in any other place, but if you are making the rules of this country, you can't have foreign influences that you're also you can't serve two masters. If you're going to be a voted legislator in this country, you can't serve two countries. You can't have all these American soldiers fighting in the IDF right now and think they can come back and be part of the American Army, the American Marine Corps and Navy. No. I mean, there's the line has to be drawn. And all I have to say is watch that speech. Watch Netanyahu. At one point when he shut everybody up and they all stopped, and he says, "No, listen to what I have to say. Stop clapping." And then he then went into this diatribe of talking about all the young Americans that were outside of the Capitol building. There were actually over 50,000 of them demonstrating around in Washington, D.C. that day. And he's saying all these people, all these young Jews and other people that are protesting, he sort of said, "I would imagine," he used some kind of phrase like that to cover his ass, but he was saying it's possible that these people are funded by the Iranians and Hamas and all that to demonstrate, and these Americans are their useful idiots. He was insulting free speech and protest. He was insulting. He not only comes into our house, the House of Representatives, and take it over with all these paid clapping seals, so-called US legislators. He just insulted our youth. Now, you don't have to agree with I mean, if you understand this democracy, if the neo-Nazis want to have a parade in your town, as long as they're peaceful, they have as much right to do that as Antifa if they're peaceful. I mean, for most of my career, I had James Randi making a career trying to take me off media, take me, to basically a crusade, he said, against my work. But I'll tell you this, I don't know what the late Mr. Randi would do, but if I found that Mr. Randi was having similar problems with people trying to shut him up, I would defend him, because he has a right not to like what I do. He has a right even to, he didn't actually, he was going to talk people into taking me out and not being on TV anymore. But okay, he's free to do that. I respect that. I disagree with him. I fought him tooth and nail all those years, but I would defend him if people were shutting him up. He can be critical. You can't take criticism. You're a child. And so many people are just children in adult bodies because of this education system. And I tell you, this is the problem, whenever the common denominator of stupid is always what dominates. It's the weakest thing about democracy, is that the dark side of democracy is it becomes the lowest bar is where everybody goes. So in a democracy that does not keep its education system very involved, keeping its population literate, making sure they know their rights, that they know their constitution, and they know how their government works. Like I was trained, I couldn't get a high school diploma in the early 70s, 1970s, unless I could pass knowing that my constitutional rights, my civil rights, how the Congress and how the whole government worked. That used to be, you just really can't call yourself a complete American unless you know what how it works, because you are a citizen. You're not supposed to vote somebody in and forget about it and just live your little life, or you got the mess we have now. This is the result of people not in America being encouraged, and neither encouraging themselves to remain smart, to remain literate, to know what's going on in your country, to know what's going on with your politicians. Because democracy requires more citizen participation than totalitarianism. Hey, if you got Hitler running you, or Stalin or Mao Zedong, you just go march like a little robot, a drone, in red squares of Beijing or Russia. Well, now we're turning into the Soviet Union. What the hell is going on with the Democrat Party right now? What is going on with this? Kamala Harris has the possibility of, if Biden passes before, or has to just leave because he's completely incapacitated. If you can't run a campaign, what the hell makes you think you can run be president of the United States? He should be immediately retired. And Kamala Harris, then his designated vice president, should become the president. But if that happens, and it could, here's somebody who would literally never would have become the president of the United States, never being voted by the American people. She tried her hand at politics, national politics, in February of 2020 in the Iowa caucuses. She goes in the first or second debate. Tulsi Gabbard, and the former congresswoman of Hawaii, serves still active reserve. I think she's a lieutenant colonel, medic course. So she's been in the wars and nursed and worked with the wounded of our foreign imperial wars. She go find it and watch it. She eviscerated her in 2 minutes, and And then she tried to kind of come back, but then she just took her part even more. And then the following day, that was actually in that 2 minutes, she was completely taken out of the primaries in 2020. And she didn't even finish. I don't think she even got to New Hampshire. She was under 1% of the population of Iowa cared about voting for her. So, but the day after this evisceration happened, where she was a real leader, she might have really answered point for point where this was wrong. All she did was play this passive aggressive thing where she just shrugged and kind of said, well, you've got to expect if you're an A-list candidate that the lower candidates are going to go after you. That was in so many words what she said. And shortly after that, she had to bug out because she couldn't be elected. Now, Barack Obama influences completely the election. He steps in when he can see an opportunity for Biden to win something, because he'd been losing everything, New Hampshire, and I think Nevada, and then came South Carolina. And South Carolina, he could use Clyburn, or the head of the Black Caucus in the House of Representatives in the Congress. He applied some pressure on him to make sure the black vote in South Carolina got out big time for Biden. So those people were told to vote for Biden. They were told to just do it. It wasn't people coming out to vote their conscience. And so they did. Biden won big, and then Obama started playing kingmaker, picking up the phone, and within a month and a half, he had almost stripped all the candidates competing out of the race. He almost had and it's amazing how all of them, Buttigieg and others, they all ended up getting nice, juicy posts in the Biden cabinet. So obviously, Obama is bribing them. You get out, I'll get you. What part of the cabinet would you like to be in? Because you know you're not going to win. And so there was only Bloomberg, Bernie Sanders, and Tulsi Gabbard that were left. And then Bloomberg cut out, and he got a deal somehow. And then, so one man's vote was the vote that counted upon millions and millions of Democratic voters. And it was Barack Hussein Obama. His vote nullified democracy in this primary of 2020. Finally, Bernie Sanders and Gabbard got out, and eventually Gabbard had to leave the party because they just too blue dog for them. So the designated candidate that you all have to vote for, and there's a lot of suspicion whether you all did. If there was certainly a lot of people that were dead that voted. I maybe they felt an affinity with Mr. Biden. Sorry, that's very bad, but there you go. He's like one of us. Let's get out of our graves and vote for him. And again, you can't have in 2020 more people voting than actually are registered and have this be clean. So there's something wrong. And the other thing is that the court was given the job of proving that the count happened properly. The trials that the dumb people on Trump's side tried to do were not about, no, this is voter fraud. They were just, it was about how the ballots were handled. And so because of that technicality, a lot of the things that were, well, this looks like fraud, the judges said, no, that's not what we're dealing with. You're just, and that was the stupidity of Giuliani and his lawyers, which were terrible. They terribly served Trump and the nation. So the thing is that, so basically Kamala Harris was picked to be vice president. Situation happened that Biden, which I had been warning since 2018, had dementia, and one of the first people. I love how everybody's starting to say, "Oh, I saw it a half a year ago." I was writing about it by 2019. I was on Coast to Coast again and again talking about, is this the best you've got? A man who's now I am cognitively declining. And so now he's declined enough. Donald Trump had an assassination attempt, and that was not long after CNN did a political assassination on Biden with that debate, that weird earlier than normal debate, months before it usually happens. And have you guys noticed that the debate was scheduled right around D-Day, the 80th anniversary? And if you have an issue with somebody who really needs lots of naps and sleeps, and if you throw, I think it was done on purpose to go take him to Europe, take him 6 hours ahead of his usual sleeping cycle. And if you don't get rest at any age, it tells on your health. But if you're that old, it tells big. I think that, I mean, why schedule it just when he's going to be completely jet lagged? It's because the powers that be in the Democratic Party, probably Obama and Clinton, because they're the two houses, the dynasties that still run the Democratic Party. All their people are a mix of who's who of the House Clinton and House Obama people in this mix cabinet that runs Biden. I don't think he runs it himself. And so you've got all that happening. And eventually, so they decided they had to pull the plug on Joe. And it's interesting because I think if Trump had been killed, I don't think this would have happened. But because Trump survived the assassination attempt, they decided, well, we got to go with new blood. Because I tell you, unfortunately, I am getting ready to do my official predictions, which I've been doing since 1968. But the way things are developing, I may very well say, and I won't do it till October, but I'm leaning towards this, is that I said back on Coast to Coast in 2019 and early 2020, I thought that would be the last election that that would be the turn, that our election system would be shown to be broken. Now, it looks like this might as well be the Politburo in Moscow during the Soviet times, where they basically have this kind of walk through one choice. And I wouldn't be surprised if Kamala Harris, who could only win less than 1% of the vote of little Iowa, ends up, I don't know if this election can even be done legally or correctly. Our system's broken. And I may very well be saying, well, of course it's going to be Kamala Harris, because it's not what they usually do when I tune into the people. That's how I've done it since I feel the people, but I feel the people in this one are not going to have a say, or they're going to be so pablumized by their lack of literacy politically and all, it's just taken all these generations to do, since I saw the beginning of it back when I was in high school, back in the early 70s of the last century. I'm thinking we're all going to see the fruits, the bitter harvest of dumbing down the United States is going to be basically democracy in name only. It is like what you hear in, it was Aldous Huxley who wrote The Brave New World, his dystopian thing. He also wrote Brave New World Revisited. And he had a quote in it that was quite remarkable. He said, well, what will happen in the United States is that you won't see the House and the Senate overthrown. You won't see the presidency overthrown. The Supreme Court will still be there. The Constitution will still be there. All the rules will still be there. And it'll just be kabuki. The real power is behind the scenes of it. And they need the appearance of democracy still happening in the United States. It's dying. I think what's clear in this election that's coming is it will mark the end of democracy in the United States. And now the question will be, will the American people win it back from special interests, from this deep state? I mean, I wouldn't vote for Trump. I never will. You know, a lot of people do this binary thing. Well, if you're saying this about them, then you don't like Democrats. No, I think a Democrat that should be running as a candidate for the Democrat Party is the one that was denied, Bobby Kennedy, and he was forced to go out. He has a lot more interesting ideas. I think I'm shocked that a man can be so intelligent as he and have these incredible blind spots about his denial about the genocide that's already killed over 200,000 Palestinians in the most brutal ways. And he has this complete blind spot to that. He can't let that in, and yet he is so sharp. And I've struggled with it sometimes. I'm thinking, yeah, but if he can't see what's happening there, what is this schizoid kind of thing where he can be so brilliant and he literally can look at what's going on in Gaza and just not see what's happening? How can a man with such intelligence do that? Now, I haven't looked at his astrology yet for my final report. So next time when I publish for Hogue Prophecy in October, I will have the astrology to see if I can figure out why that's happening. And maybe in a show we can talk about it too. You know, this is a full-time job. I just released overnight into the morning my Hogue Prophecy report. I think it's one of the perhaps the best I've ever done. It just some other level happened to it, and I'm already getting feedback from my readers that they're saying this because it just said, "Wow, where are we going?" Because I'm a medium. I do it that way. It's like I was in this whole other space with it. But don't believe it, read it, become a member, become a subscriber, and then see if I'm full of it or not. So I lean towards Kennedy personally, but that doesn't affect my. I pick presidents that when I see a certain person, well, like for instance, I'm thinking more and more Kamala is going to win by default. The fault of us not being literate with our Constitution. So she could end up being the person who lost an Iowa caucus with less than 1% of the vote, who was picked to be your next president. And that really gets weird when you realize that she would then be, as I've said before on this show, citing the Kabbalah and numerology of Kabbalah, that would make her the 47th president. And I've said it's a kind of, it's used to be called dead man walking number. But what it also means is somebody is like an empty suit, an empty dress, somebody who's just there, somebody of an amoral quality who will just do what the puppet masters ask them to do. In a way, Biden has been this. And my sense is that 4 more years of Biden will be wearing a dress and be named Kamala Harris. And the talk, and you know what? In a way, it's justice, karmic justice. A nation that's let itself go so stupid will be picking one of the dumbest people that has ever been a president in the United States. I think that's right. America deserves that until Americans stop being stupid and electing stupid people. So that's another big backstory of this war. And the danger of this Third World War, which now it has its Ukrainian front, and since October 7th of last year, it now has the more dangerous Middle Eastern front, dangerous from a prophetic angle, because that's my field. Ukraine's not mentioned outright in any of the great prophecies, Nostradamus and stuff like that, even Case here and stuff. It's not there. But there's a whole lot of mention in Nostradamus, especially of Persia, the Arabian Gulf, which is called the Persian Gulf now. Then it was called the Arabian Gulf. He's talking about some great fleet of the Ishmaelites coming out of Carmania. Carmania is the coastline of the Strait of Hormuz, where over 20% of your oil goes in out into the Persian Gulf. And Carmania is where Bandar Abbas, the Bandar Abbas, is the harbor of Abbas, is where most of the Iranian fleet would be coming out to close the Strait of Hormuz. And there's a naval battle. And there's also the talk about the fleet will be melted and sunk by the Trident. And it'll be the fleet of the true serpent. Now, it takes decades to learn Renaissance ways of making prophecies and metaphors and classical prophecies and all. And almost no one who presumes to be a Nostradamus published author seems to have done any of this work and miss the whole key of most of Nostradamus's prophecies being classically and biblically oriented from a Renaissance mid-1550s point of view. And so the true serpent, what would that be? Well, the true serpent is on a flag, the Navy Jack. Used to be flown the year after 9/11. For years during the Bush administration, it used to be flown with the rattlesnake on 13 stripes, half of the majority of them yellow, intersected by red stripes, and then the snake is just slithering straight across it with the words underneath, "Don't tread on me." Well, that was the true serpent of the United States Revolutionary Navy. Now it looks like they've made the flag bigger with blue and red backfields, and now the center thing is a snake coiled to strike the rattlesnake, and "Don't tread on me." So that may be the new Navy Jack, but it's the true serpent. That's what I contend it is. The Navy that will be sunk is the true serpents, and it's sunk by the Trident. Now, I know a lot of you out there are saying, "Oh yeah, Trident, you mean the Ohio-class submarines, the nuclear submarines. It's got to be that." Well, it could be. I don't deny the possibility. However, have you ever looked closely at the Iranian flag? The Iranian flag is a tricolor, horizontal. It has green, a white field, and then a red field. With that design is actually Farsi or Persian of prayers. Now, in the center of the white field, you will see this interesting geometric red symbol or geometrics in the middle. And I studied what it means from the Persian, Iranian, Farsi point of view. It is an abstract of the red tulip of the martyrs. There's a large grave field outside of Tehran, the capital of Iran, where many of the hundreds of thousands of Iranians that died in the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s are buried. It's called the Cemetery of the Martyrs. And the idea is that the myth, the mythology in Islam is the Shahid, the martyr. When they are buried, red tulips grow out of their grave in the red color of blood. So the Iranian flag is actually making that statement. And what's also, if you look deeper into it, you'll notice that the Iranian flag, the tulip buds, are like two crescents that are not actually attached to the center of the flower. And if you look closer where the shada is because it's Arabic Persian, Muhammad's name, I believe, or there's no God but God, and I think you will see that there's a sword in the center line where the shada is, and on both sides of it you have a trident. You have these two ends here, the tulips that are flowing buds out here, the sword making the point of the trident. So it could just as easily be as the melted and sunk ships are sunk by a nuclear attack, melted and sunk by Ohio-class tridents. I don't Rule it out. But given Nostradamus's predilection for flags and codes and things, at least it leans much more for this being the trident. He saw that as a flag with a trident with some little red extemporaneous sides to it, but the main thing is a trident. So those of the trident then have an equal chance of melting and sinking U.S. ships in the Persian Gulf or outside of it. The other thing to understand is modern ships, the superstructures of modern ships are not heavily armored. So when there's fires, and if you're from the 16th century and you're seeing big fires and superstructures of ships with a lot of aluminum and other things in it, they all appear to be melting. And it doesn't mean that they're melting because of a nuclear blast. I mean, I looked at the Bikini atomic blast where they put all the mothballed, the USS Saratoga aircraft carrier of the United States and all these retired ships, including German battle cruisers and also Japanese battleships, and they put them all out there to see what a hydrogen bomb would do to them all. And they didn't look too melted or something, just pretty much singed. But and a lot of them just sank after that. But you could see a lot of melting of superstructures and things in the way they build them now. So that's another possibility. I'm not saying that's what it is. My job mainly is to give you all the possible options and see where it goes. So Persia is mentioned, Syria is mentioned, the Levant is mentioned as battlefields of the Third World War. And it makes sense when you think of it, with all the three Western religions all being eschatologically inclined to having a judgment day, a final battle. The Islam, in fact, in my book, Nostradamus, The War with Iran, my last edition also had a big section about Islamic prophecies. Because the Islamic end time prophecies are probably even more detailed than the book of Revelation and Daniel and all of that about what's going on. But you would never know it because, we're a country where if we do designate somebody our enemy, we will not make the effort to know our enemy. And what makes you think you will defeat an enemy you're ignorant of? Even if they are an enemy, just conjecture here. I think we make them our enemies. I don't think they have any interest in. They didn't drill the two towers in New York because they hate our freedom. Dumb. No, they wanted to give a little back of the hundreds of thousands of people we've killed in their world. Oh, we lost 3,000. They would go. I mean, taxi drivers were saying this, and some of the people that were in Afghanistan, they were traveling around before it was shut down. Taxi cabbies even were saying, "Oh, 3,000! My God, you Americans killed that before breakfast with us." 200,000 Palestinians. Your country's aiding and abetting Israel, who has bought your government to commit the biggest genocide since the Holocaust against fellow Semites. The seed of Abraham is Arab and Hebrew. And Abraham, when he was initially in the first three messages from the Lord of Hosts, if you read your Bible, what has been called Eretz Israel, which is the promised land for the seed of Abraham, he was to seed the place with all of his seed, Arabs and Hebrews, Jews. Eretz Israel should be called Eretz Abraham, the greater nation of Abraham's seed. And they should be living in harmony. That's what Ahmadinejad in 2009 was trying to say in Farsi about how the real solution is not two states in enmity. The real solution is one state. He felt it should be a Palestine that had equal rights for Jews and Arabs. And he said in Farsi something that meant it would disappear from the map of history. But the context being is it's not disappeared like wiped out. It's disappearing because a new nation that has Jews and Arabs living in harmony is in its place. That's what his dream was. But Farsi couldn't translate that well. And the Farsi translators made a big mistake by saying, and then Israel be wiped off the map, because they didn't have a word for the more nuanced, just it'll cease to be. Not in a they only could find something in English which really is a violent act, which is not what Ahmadinejad was saying, the president of Iran at the time, in his speech. But Netanyahu, freshly back as prime minister since he was in the 90s, and then went on to be prime minister in the longest time of any Israeli prime minister. He fresh back into the game in 2009. He sees that mistranslation and fed it into the victim syndrome of the Israeli people. They want to wipe us off the map. Those people want to wipe us off the map. Look what's happening to the Palestinians. They're being wiped off the map. Maybe a little projection going on here, Mr. Netanyahu. So then he said, and I didn't know it then until in October 7th, when he said it again against the Palestinians. I always had a sense that his offices, like he's trying to hide behind his secretaries and all, they sent a message to Ahmadinejad in 2009 that said just two words: think Amalek for the wipe off the map, which is not what he said. Exploited by Netanyahu to use fear and toxicity to keep more and more power. He's now ready to go to war to save his seat as prime minister, World War III, to save his behind from being put in jail for all the graft and corruption that the courts are starting to gather to go after him with. And so on October 7th, he starts saying, think Amalek again. The whole idea that Amalek are people who are not human. They may look like humans, but they're goyim. They have no souls. And according to certain, I would say, misinterpretations of the Talmudic law, they can do whatever they want with soulless non-Jewish people, including, you've got to wonder, there's people that must believe this is so, because there was this whole riot when 8 or 9 IDF prison guards were caught sodomizing Palestinian prisoners, men and women. It's on camera now. There's pictures of it and movies of it. The security camera stuff is being leaked. And what was the response? A bunch of people came in and demanded those people be freed because they did nothing wrong. Well, if you have a law that says that non-Jewish people really have no soul, and therefore how can there be a sin, whatever you do with them? You can even convince them to fight and die for your own wars. That's what Netanyahu has been trying to do his entire career, is get his big dumb brother, the American enabler, to step right in the Persian Gulf and fight a war with Iran. And we've never been closer to that happening. I started writing copies of Nostradamus and the war with Iran. My first edition was in 2007. I updated it a little in 2012 and did a major update in 2013. It's now I'm looking at, oh my God, this is going to have these hypothetical battles and wars, and the U.S. fleet coming into a small area, being overwhelmed by higher technology of missile stuff happening. Hypersonic missiles hitting carriers, cracking their keels. All that stuff I wrote about is kind of like science fiction. Now it could soon, within days, weeks, become science fact. It's too bad. I write about a lot of potentially dark things, and I never want to see them happen. I write about them so that they don't happen. I wrote about Biden not being fit to be president because he isn't. And now we have the situation we have. And now it's gotten so bad that the Democratic Party doesn't even have primaries. I mean, they picked Biden to be the guy. You know that a lot of the primaries, you probably in some of your states, if you're a Democrat in Florida, you didn't even get to vote. They said, no, we're just going to cancel the primary. It's Biden. You're not even going to go through. You're not even going to go through when, this has happened before where one person clearly was going to get it, but they still all went to the primaries. The people still had a chance to choose or write somebody in if they don't want this person to choose. I mean, Johnson pretty much, well, Johnson probably could have, anyway, that's the point is that um this primary didn't happen in 2020. It was chosen, it was stopped. New Hampshire, by the way, wanted their primary to happen because they're very independent. But the super delegates kept changing the rules for each state. And one of the things they did for New Hampshire, they said, oh, you can vote, but we will consider whoever your vote is as a vote for Biden. Look it up. It happened. So you could have voted for somebody else. It would have been counted for Biden. That's just what they do in the Soviet Union in the old days. We are the Soviet Union now, of Soviet Union of United States of Soviet Union states. And so that is, so we're going to have to face, not only are we facing a conventional war, a world war that's spreading not just in the Middle East, but getting back to Taiwan. The plan is America, I guess you got to have a demented president to have such a plan, wants to, I mean, here's Hitler doing a two-front war, which destroyed Germany in World War One. But he did it anyway, even though he was against it. But he thought, okay, Britain's kind of on the ropes. We'll win these guys in 8 weeks. 3 months will destroy the Soviet Union. You just have to, infamously said, you just have to kick down the front door and the whole rotten edifice, Soviet Union will collapse. Well, it was sorely tried in the first months, but the Soviet Union turned around and marched the Nazis all the way back to Berlin, and were the reason why Hitler lost World War II more than everything else was a sideshow. Necessary. Although the amount of weapons that we sent to Russia, especially the 450,000 Ford trucks that we shipped through Murmansk. You talk to Russians, despite what is going on today, they still, because they remember their history, they still thank us for those Ford trucks. Without those trucks, they couldn't have amassed huge offensives without having to be able to stuff men into them and across the vast tracts of Russia. It might have kept the war going another 2 years. So we had our part. It was a damn important part. We could fight multiple wars then on 3 or 4 fronts on either side of the United States. It's remarkable. Our logistic capabilities were remarkable in those days. But our Navy does not have that kind of logistic support now. In fact, this war in the Middle East with the Yemenis have beat our Navy. Our ships aren't going into the Red Sea anymore because here are the poorest people, one of the poorest countries in the world, has managed to scare off the Navy, partially because the whole concepts of our Navy are outmoded for the reality of our times. This war now has been revolutionized by the drone. Anybody who is interested in the future of how war is evolving rapidly beyond what it's ever been before should watch daily what's going on in Ukraine. First, the Ukrainians were ahead of the Russians, but the Russians, as usual, learned from their mistakes, analyze the situation, and fix the problem. And now the Russians are the champions of droning and electronic warfare. The other thing too is war can never be fought with a surprise invasion like Pearl Harbor or Germany invading Russia because of eyes in the sky. All the satellites out there. Every move is seen, every soldier is noticed. So the Russians are changing strategies to adapt to that. If you have masses of Russians that would eventually be used in offensive pushes, they're hundreds of miles away from the lines now. So you don't quite know where they're going to go. And then if they do move, they'll be shipped by trucks and trains very fast, but still, they realize that you cannot surprise anybody. So what has happened is the Russians have put they have 700,000 to 1 million men on the 1,400 kilometers of the Ukrainian front, mostly in the east part, but some parts also in the north. To pull the Ukrainians, as they dumbly do, they pull 30,000 of their best troops out of the line, thinning it to fight Volchansk in Belgorod region. And now this whole thing that happened with Kursk, which is interesting. Just before I got on the show, one of my readers reminded me that in my previous Hogue Prophecy report, I talked about Belgorod as being a potential, even if the Ukrainians were able to push the Russians and go deep into the approaches of Belgorod in Russian territory, it would be just like the Battle of the Bulge that happened in the end of 1944, early 1945, when the Germans, again, according to the Nostradamus prophecy, Century 5, Quatrain 45, invaded through the Ardennes forest again to try to cut the British and the Americans where they met, divide them, take Antwerp, take their main harbor away, and then force them to get out of the war. I mean, it had a lot more logic than what the Ukrainians are doing now, but it was really not gonna. It all relied on the winter months being too bad for flying because Germany didn't have an air superiority anymore. You don't win wars if you don't have something as little as a drone or something as big as a jet commanding the skies. That's still true, even though now we have drones. I mean, you could see a situation if even in the Red Sea, you could see it if we see a sudden escalation on Hezbollah's northern front with Israel, and because they also have sea-borne, sea carrier killing missiles and stuff like that. You could even see drones. Um, the So, when we were going to Iwo Jima and Okinawa and all that in 1944, 45, we had 7,000 ships. We had a literally an iron procession from San Diego and Los Angeles all the way to the Marianas and all the islands, and we could fight the Japanese from 9,000 miles away from our homelands. But you don't have that Navy now. They've even discontinued a lot of the supply ships. What has happened in this war in the Middle East is these missile frigates of the United States fire all their missiles, and then they have to go back into Europe to restock them. The other thing is that there are certainly a lot of stocks of bombs, and I've seen they're doing it in Qatar because they have this huge airstrip there, a very big base in Qatar. We have the Fifth Fleet harbor in Bahrain and also Kuwait. But these areas, the first thing that'll happen if we go to war with Iran, the Iranians will, with all their missiles, ballistic missiles, they'll blow up all those munitions. And so what you carry with you on your ships is all you've got. When we were planning these things before, plotting 8,000 targets back in the 2007 when I started writing about this stuff, Iran didn't have the technology. They didn't have perhaps superior cruise missiles than we do now. And now because Putin said if you keep NATO firing, if you US people keep using your satellites to help the Ukrainians, and you even have your officers in bunkers guiding the missiles, and the Ukrainians are only pushing the button and launching them, you're literally NATO launching missiles into Russia. The missiles are US and British and NATO. And so the Russians have been very restrained. They're saying, well, you are using this proxy, this shield, to hide the fact that you, NATO, are fighting us. And your leaders already say, we want to break up Russia. I mean, Kaya Kallas, who's going to now be the European Union's ersatz foreign minister. They don't really have a foreign minister officially, but that's why I call it ersatz. She is a former prime minister, president of Latvia, and she is she openly talking like a baby. Just I wish I understand this. I'm not disparaging women. I know are as many intelligent women who could be leaders of our land, but you know, there's a they're not being chosen. Dumb people are being chosen. Demented people, men, are being chosen. You know, it looked like Gavin Newsom was going to be a candidate, and what's his greatest testament? This dumb fellow who ran California ran it into the ground. Now, you know, dumb comes in all genitalia shapes. Okay, so understand that there's nothing sexist in what I'm saying. It always surprises me how when I'm bashing Trump and bashing other people, no, I don't have any men running up and saying, "You don't like men." But you know, if I'm sorry, if the person's stupid, and if you think it's because I have an idea of feminine people being stupid, well, I don't. Um, there have been great leaders of the world who have been women. Cleopatra, Catherine the Great, Margaret Thatcher. I don't agree with her politics, but she was the last great prime minister of Britain. There hasn't been much since. Certainly don't agree with her politics, but I recognize that. So, so this, so we have a ship without a commander. We have a crew running the ship of our state that is basically calling the shots because it's the deep state. It's the unelected machine, very much influenced by the intelligence agencies, that is running our show here. And we have had our part in letting them get away with it and not upholding our vote. We may put a person as president who actually didn't get a real vote to be our president. I mean, it's happened. The precedent already happened in England last few years when Sunak, Prime Minister Sunak, was appointed the prime minister. He was never voted for by the British people, and he ran England for 2 years. And now he's retiring from that off to the United States to make billions of dollars in some new private thing. So, you know, this problem with democracy is not just ours. It's across the West. Germany, it's happening in France, it's happening in Britain, that the people are not being listened to. And, you know, I am not for violence, but I can look, if you do what happened in France when the crops were destroyed and Versailles, where all the rich people and the elites and the aristocracy were all eating cake and Beirut and whatever, and the people are starving and you're not listening to them, you will get someday a knock on the door. And that's what happened. The people of France amassed out of Paris and came and knocked on the door of Versailles and took the king and queen back into Paris. And that was the beginning of a turn of more intensity of the French Revolution. And I gotta wonder, because the Pluto return for the French Revolution is coming in 2034 through 36. Its return means that that whole global revolution that spread from the French Revolution over the next century, that's getting a karmic return. And it could be global this time. So we just passed through the almost 7 passes of Pluto in the American birth position, which means that era of the United States, that one orbit, is over. And so that America is dying, and now we must reinvent ourselves as Americans, like Americans do, to in difficulty. Civil War did that in with difficulty, but challenged by it to renew ourselves. After that terrible Civil War, America changed and it became a greater nation because of it. So, we're kind of we're kind of coming to the echo of those times. And it's one of the things that I think about and write about a lot of what could be echoing from those past massive history direction changing things. And given that Uranus has been in its detriment in Taurus, the ruler of revolution, which is the house of Aquarius, revolutions, humanitarian changes, original thinking, surprise turns of events. Well, now in its detriment, it is in Taurus. It's an air sign. Uranus is now in the mud and rocks and dungeon of Taurus, and it will square um, the on the Democratic Convention has some of the most jaw-dropping things that are coming. You have basically a full moon in Aquarius, which is opposed the Leo Mercury conjunction on the convention, which means Leo is moving forward in Mercury, ruler of the mind and messaging, is moving backwards as the sun, which is essence of what's happening with the party, is moving forward. So you've got a going against the grain of energies. One wants to move forward, but the mind wants to move backwards. And then you add to that a exact conjunction of Uranus, which when it's conjoined like this, it's squared. It's squared Leo and the sun and Mercury, and it's also squared its own house with a full moon on the first and second day of this convention, which means I don't think it's going to look like the Chicago convention, although I hear word that there are groups of people that do want to start riots outside of it, and that's why they've got barbed wire and big walls all around the convention center. Everybody's afraid it'll be a repeat of what happened in 1968, which I watched when I was 12 turning into 13 and a few months after it. I watched the whole thing. It was amazing. It was messy. It was democracy. It was very messy, but my concern is,
That was Dan Rather, right?
yeah, that's what Dan Rather got mugged
Yeah.
by a bunch of Mayor Daley's thugs right on camera, and you can see on the TVs the riots that were going on outside, and then they wanted to get Galbraith kicked out for the McCarthy group, and everybody's whistling that, and the way Daley had crowded everybody together, the delegates couldn't move around very well without bumping into each other. It was packed like sardines down there. It was a mess. And of course, the mess was caused by kind of a karmic echo here. The person that was, um, I mean, Robert Kennedy Sr. was assassinated. And he was ahead of the anti-war Vietnam movement, which was gaining steam and majority. But when that movement was decapitated, kind of what almost happened to Trump. And ironically, the son of that man is running, who should be in the Democrat candidate, but he's having to run independent, and they're trying to keep him out of states. So, there were problems back then, but things that are happening now are brazenly anti-democratic. So, we're under the threat of descending into this nation, looking, talking, squawking like a democracy, but it's fascist.
Do you think that have you been looking
I
at
don't
some of
know
the
how long
pictures?
I'll be allowed to say this, folks.
Right. Well, the with the with Kamala's um, rallies, there's been some pictures that have been coming out that look like they're AI
Mhm.
driven.
Yeah, I saw him.
So yeah, and
Well, and
some
not
of
only
the
that, did you know when they had the whole indoor stadium full of people just
yeah.
Trump rally? Her crew has her speak before concerts. Those people were a trapped audience. They came to
Mhm.
see some big rock band.
So
You know, and she'd
my
come and
take
make
on
some talks and have a speech and leave, and then they go, okay, she's out
exactly
of here. Let's listen to the band.
exactly my take on this is that there's not really a strong voter base that really wants her as president. So they kind of have to fake it, right?
Yeah, well, it's true
And then
because
and so,
I
but they're manufacturing a consensus
exactly,
within mainstream media,
you know,
so they can
Al
plausibly,
in the Red Revolution, man.
flip the election.
Well, yeah, it's looking, I
That's
mean,
how
it's
I see
fake.
it's going to
It's
happen.
all fake, and the media's
Yeah.
behind it. And I mean, this kind of stuff is dangerous because, and then I have in this my reports, the things that were said, and Trump's responsible for it too. All this hate speech and, lock her up, lock him up, all this stuff that's going on. Trump had his part in the violence escalating, but I mean, my God, Biden was given a script, which he doesn't read. He can read anything. He sometimes when he's reading his scripts, in his notes, he'll say, "Stop, turn left." You know?
Mhm.
So they had to stop putting those in the notes that he always carries. He said, and that's what we should do. Stop. And
Wait
so,
for clap.
yeah,
Wait for
wait.
clap.
Yeah, that's the one. He said, wait for a clap. It's, so um, the, it was almost like, and we're not out, out of the woods yet with that. We've actually had two assassination attempts. Um, One was a literal one in Butler, Pennsylvania, had just grazed his ear of one candidate. The other candidate was successfully politically assassinated, and the weapon was CNN, the debate. Like I was saying before, they wore him out. They scheduled him to do all this stuff that at his age is just going to show his vulnerabilities. He had kind of a dry throat, which he was coughing a lot. Well, that could have been all those hours in Air Force One flying all over Europe and all that and back to the United States. He's no youngster for that. And he's 81 going 91. And um he was tired, he was hoarse, he was when they had the two cameras going. Did you notice how CNN in any debates in the past wouldn't give Trump a chance to retort? He'd have to force himself in, but that's the difference. But when Trump would say, "Can I say something about what he said before?" Oh yeah, sure, go on. I mean, 4 years ago, he would say something. No, no, it's enough. You've had your thing. The same people, Tapper, those people. When they were a guy going every time going, "Oh yes, go ahead." So this was set up to expose what they all knew because, we don't pick presidents anymore. We get puppets. And, it's as bad as the half-dead people the Soviet Union were rolling in, Chernenko and Andropov. And then finally Gorbachev, an actual younger man, came in. These people were 1 foot in the grave. It was, you know what that is? That's a sign of the end of an empire. The Soviet Empire was on its last legs. We're rolling in people who should be in a home, old folks' home, and we're going to replace them with pliant, amoral, dumb candidates that are not going to be leaders. They're going to be part of the team. and play the game. I mean, classic example, everybody. I mean, Kamala Harris tried to show that she had seen these Palestinians getting killed, kids, women, children, heaps, horrifically with 1,000-pound bombs. I mean, I don't know how many times I've seen just parts of people from these attacks. She saw some of them and she was thinking, oh, wow, is she? Because there is this thing in her astrology where the shock of leadership might mature her. I wrote about that 4 years ago. I was surprised. I was happy to see it. And actually, I was hopeful that some of these things in astrology, sometimes you get the job and the job grows you up. But I'm afraid I said it was very long. It was a long shot. But this is a different America now. The situation is, it's not grow up, it's shut up and do what we tell you. And then
Well,
that's what
you bring up
happened.
a great
She
point.
had this icy talk with Benjamin Netanyahu, and then after that happened, a few days later, suddenly she's not talking about Palestine anymore. So
Exactly.
somebody pulled her aside and said, honey, shut up and do what we tell you.
All right. So,
If you want to be president, you got to play it our way.
what I noticed with the Biden administration from day one is it's not just Biden, but it's Blinken, it's Kirby, it's
They're all dumb.
all the press secretaries,
Yeah.
Harris. They all have a cue card that they're
Yeah.
reading off of, and they have a 3-ring binder
Yeah.
that they're looking at for every single question that is
Yeah,
brought up.
Jean-Pierre, she's always looking at her
It's
binder.
yes, it, she's just dumb. She's just dumb. She's
They're all
dumb.
dumb.
What surprises me is that even ones that have some arc of history of foreign policy, even though we may disagree with them or whatever, but Kirby and Blinken have some level of historical arc, all
Yeah,
right, of,
not
of
very.
knowledge of foreign policy.
Yeah, not
But the
very
thing is
impressive,
that
by the way.
no, but the issue here is that they're all reading off of a cue card.
That's right.
And so who's writing on the cue card? Who's
Who's
pulling the
running the country,
strings?
America? Who's running your country?
Yeah, yeah. It's
We don't know
scary.
who's running the
It's
country.
scary.
It's not who you voted for.
I
And
don't
when you,
remember anyone in Trump's administration doing that though.
well, it had a different kind of evil going on. I mean, they were playing on Trump's astrological weak. They probably didn't know this astrology tells this, but Trump's biggest weakness is he's a very wide open and impressionable,
Right.
especially if you flatter him, uh, a medium. He's a very powerful medium, and if you flatter him, he'll channel you. He's got this 10-year-old blind love for any man in a uniform, like a kid. Oh, wow, he's cool, man. And and the thing is that his affliction with his mediumistic stuff, I won't get into psychobabble about it, I'll just tell it in layman's terms. It is weak enough a square inharmonious aspect that it's sometimes he's on in a good way and sometimes he's off. For instance, when he was on and read a guy right was when he said about John Bolton before he was his NSA chief. He was saying, and then there's this Bolton, and he just wants to go to war with everybody. He said that right out on camera. One of those, the innocent 8-year-old in him is actually very important, but there's another side of him is the gullible 8-year-old. And so the square was off when he said that. But then a few months later, the square was on, and he picked that guy, the one who wants to fight with everybody, as his NSA chief. And I know how all the Trump people like to say he didn't get us into a war. Well, they tried very hard, and he almost, because of that square on, got us into 3 wars during his administration. And I won't go into the details of it because I'm babbling on so much anyway. But the so it happened with Bolton in June of 2019. We had a global big global drone that was flying over the Strait of Hormuz, very sensitive area, and it flew into Carmania, the place talked about as Nostradamus's flashpoint for this future war, for the tridents and melted sinking ships. And for several hours, the Iranians were saying in English, "You're in our territory, you're in our airspace, get out or we'll shoot you down." So after several hours, they shot the drone down. It was picked up by the Iranians on their side of the Strait of Hormuz. They showed it, here it is. They have pictures of it going down. Now, John Bolton, now Trump's square was on that day, and what I've heard from some sources through the Duran, that from people who, I think it's Larry Johnson, former CIA person, very good source, I watch on the Duran a lot. He had friends that were there during those moments, and he was saying he remained secret because he had a lot of secret powers and stuff. But anyway, he told him that they were coercing Trump to do it. They were like all these guys being very authoritative. Mr. President, I mean, they're as respectful enough to call him Mr. President. They're all breathing on him to do it, and he was not wanting to. His nature is actually not to go to war. He'd rather make a deal. He's a deal maker. He's transactional. He's not a leader. He's transactional. So if you're going to make him a leader, you've got to work with those strengths. I do something here and then you do something for me, and which is also a big element of negotiating, not just in business, but in diplomacy. It's like, okay, you caught us with the Hercules missiles in Turkey, says Khrushchev. And we made a mistake. We thought we could put our missiles as close to your borders in Cuba as you did to us in the Crimean area. Okay, well, the reason why we did that is because you got those Hercules missiles in Turkey. That's why we did the Cuban Missile Crisis, or put the missiles there. And okay, now we're pulling them out. But the only way that worked is that Bobby Kennedy's father talked to Dobrynin, the ambassador of the Soviet Union, and they did a deal in his office where they agreed that we can't publicly say we're going to pull the missiles out, but if you pull your missiles out in 6 months, we'll pull those Hercules missiles out. They're obsolete anyway. So we were planning to do it. So we'll just, but don't do it at the same time because it's quid pro quo. It'll look bad. It'll look bad for both of us. So, I mean, this is making a deal. You lose something, you gain something. You gain you get the missiles out, but you're doing it peacefully and civilly, and that's all good. And then when no one gives a damn anymore, the threat, which the Hercules missiles really were, also pulled out. That's there's more of that kind of transactional potential in a Trump administration than what's going on now. And it was also, as Robert Barnes, I strongly recommend if you check him out. He's a very interesting legal source of mine, and he has worked in the lawfare situation, giving advice to Trump. But he's a fascinating person to listen to about all of this, the lawfare and everything. And so it was very interesting to hear that he got some scuttlebutt about who Trump really wants for his cabinet. And I mean, it's interesting. He's been talking to Bobby Kennedy Jr. Tulsi Gabbard might end up being the Secretary of Defense. That's why they're going on her now. There's been a lot of trying to eyes in the sky and all that because of some of the things she said about the deep state the other day. And now she's under surveillance. She may be the Secretary of State. He said that he would like to have at least one cabinet member be a libertarian. And, the former Democrat, Bobby Kennedy, could be Attorney General like his father. That's another possibility. He was talking about some other people, there was this rumor that Jamie Dimon was going to be involved in his cabinet, and Frick, the guy who runs BlackRock. And of course, that would really, if he was doing this, it's like he's just going back to the same old BS of his channeling problems again. He's saying one thing, doing another. But actually, Trump came out and said, no, no, I'm not doing that. And he didn't leave it hanging like he did in the last election time. He immediately stepped on and said, no, 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 I don't want Diamond and those people. No. And so there's signs that he's learned a lot from what happened to him.
I hope so. I hope so, because
And
there was just
actually, his um I I don't know what's going to happen to this country if the powers that be make puppets for another 4 years. I don't know if this country can survive that, because it will probably by 2026, when these idiots have started to renew um, intermediate missiles. America's starting to base nuclear tip intermediate missiles in Denmark. And by 2026, they're going to have them all over Germany. The Russians have said, Putin has said, when this was intermediate missiles treaty was bugged out by Trump, one of the worst things he did as a channel ever, because it literally means life or death for the future of the human race. Because do any of you have read about the Pershing 2s and the SS-20 Soviet missiles? Intermediate range means that they had hundreds, thousands of them all over Europe, Eastern and Western Europe. And with too little time, if one was launched by accident or by intent, without the whole goddamn thing going up in flames in nuclear war. It was the most dangerous part of the war back in the first Cold War, which ended in 1990. The second Cold War started, in my view, in 2014 with the Ukrainian Civil War and the march towards the proxy war that has been the first major front of a conventional phase of the Third World War. What they've set in motion, America getting out of these treaties, the Russians were not going to start building missiles. They honored the treaty, even though Trump bugged out of it. That the square was on when that happened. And but then last year, in 2023, when the Americans were putting them in Denmark, starting, now the Russians are preparing to build hundreds, thousands of nuclear-tipped intermediate range missiles that can strike Europe in 4 minutes. And we're right back to what the INF Treaty in the late 1980s saved us from. Because frankly, if that treaty hadn't happened, I wouldn't be talking to you right now, and you wouldn't be hearing me. You'd probably be in a world without any electricity, and you would probably be in a world where if you went out to try to harvest the crops that are remaining in the world, you would probably get overly radioactive from radiation from the ozone hole that would be created by 3,000, 4,000 nuclear weapons being lit off in the late 80s. Britain, rather than having 63 million people, would be down to 12 million. 2/3 of the human race would be dead. The rest would be living in a kind of medieval post-Mad Max situation. That it didn't happen because we had smarter people on both sides. There's still smarter people on the Russian and Chinese side, by the way. The global majority is smarter than us. We're just 17% of the world's population, the West. We're a little sideshow, but we have nukes, and we've had this habit of the last 500 years of exploiting the rest of the world. And it's almost in the DNA of the stupid politicians of the West that they just can't conceive of no longer having dominance over the global majority. Well, it's actually really good what's happening. The global majority is growing up. It's waking up. It's taking responsibility for itself because it's no longer under our foot. When are Americans going to take responsibility for themselves? I guess we're going to learn in the next few years. But I am, I must say, at least what I'm seeing is there's more. I mean, I think it's pretty amazing that Bobby Kennedy and Trump have already been talking about the possibility of him being the FDA head, so he can really deal with the whole um, the plague problem and the things that happen because of the sickness. But the other is Attorney General. He's also thinking of making him the Attorney General. I mean, his father's position in the Kennedy administration of his uncle, John Kennedy. So, it's
Do you
interesting.
think that they'll release the some of the documents about the assassination
Um,
of
if
JFK?
if yeah, that was the other thing Barnes talked about, yes, it'll finally happen. Not and not only that, what happened to Trump will be all released just a few weeks ago, and the Kennedy. And it's an interesting story that Judging Freedom with Judge Napolitano. I never watched him when he was on Fox, but so I can't really compare if he's changed at all. But he seemed to be a pretty fair guy, and not some right-wing foxoid that I thought he might have been. So I find the show very interesting. And he used to get phone calls. This is the other thing about Trump that I'm finding out, that he's always asking questions of people. And I hear the questions. He he wants to figure it all out before he makes decisions. I don't see Biden and Blinken and Yan even thinking about questions. I mean, when the Chinese in the Anchorage conference, right, the beginning of the Biden administration, Blinken and Wang Yi, a formidable diplomat, as is Sergei Lavrov. Wang Yi said, look, the situation's changed. We're not the same people, you yellow people you can bark around and order around. And they went right at him and said, you've got to change this whole tone with us because we're not some underling. We are an economy that in our activity of buying and selling went ahead of you in 2016. So, you can play with your GDP games and all that, but we are now the number one economy. So don't bark around us like you this way anymore. And so he went on for, rather than the 10 minutes, he went on for like 20 minutes. And you know what Blinken's response was? Well, you're not supposed to go against the time zone. You went too long in the time. What a dummy. Blinken. Yeah, he's been in the diplomatic service as many years. Yeah, there are a lot of dumb people in the diplomatic service that have been advanced over other people, and he's one of them. He is the worst Secretary of State. He's even Mike Pompeo. Nobody I like was a better Secretary of State than this fellow. Um,
I feel that the Biden administration there's a playbook, and that playbook is
it
coming from CFR and the Trilateral Commission, and
is
that
it is
anything that
them
deviates,
filtered
it's like,
through the House Clinton and the House Obama. They're like the
yeah,
globalists, all
okay.
that you're saying, but it's filtered through Clinton's contacts and Obama's contacts to their team.
Hmm.
Obama
Hmm.
still sees himself having a third term, and he tried it with Biden. He's going to try it with Kamala. He's, it's that man. Talk about a guy who can charm the devil. I mean, I talk a lot about him. I mean, the fact that this man voted for Biden and made him president. Now he's voting for Kamala Harris, and 340 million Americans don't have a say in it. That's change you can believe in. That's yes, we can. you know, yes, we
It's
can.
interesting. I I was listening to an audiobook of Ted Kennedy and his life. So just
Well,
before he
died.
died, he had cancer, he had brain
Yep.
cancer, and it was being treated, but it was he was going to die. He knew he was going to die. And so he wrote this book, and it was called True Compass. And it's a story of his life, but there's a lot of humor in it because there was a lot
Yeah.
of like things that happened in his life that you would never have thought that it would have happened. Him riding a Bronco, or he's in a rodeo, or he's in a ski slope and he's doing a ski jump and stuff for his brother to get votes and stuff. But he had an amazing life, but there was also a dark side to the Kennedys too. And he did mention when he reached to the audience of the United States after Chappaquidda, that there was a curse, and you brought up this curse at the Kennedys. But what was interesting about the book was he was talking about this, as he's basically seeing the sunset of his life. Obama comes onto the scene, and how he talks about how he really took him under his wing to try to help him out, rightfully or wrongly. But I mean, but the thing is that it's interesting to see that this one individual that it was a part of a family that had so much political history, with the United
Full
States,
spectrum,
and
all good,
that
bad,
yeah.
and
And the thing is that he was even though he was kind of the little one that wasn't considered that was going to get any, be successful at all, he was the most influential. I
yeah.
think that he was more influential in U.S. politics than JFK.
Oh
I mean,
yeah,
a lot
well,
of people,
he survived. If Bobby and John had not been killed, it would be a very, very different future
right,
than the one we've lived in.
right,
Because things, which brings me back to Napolitano. He was talking to Jeffrey Sachs as a guest, very interesting guest.
mm, mm,
Uh, he's also matured over time. And he appeals to me because he was about a year older than me, but we are both children of the Cuban Missile Crisis that got woken up very early. He was already 7, I was just turning 7, and it's defined our lives in our very different careers. It was interesting to see him say that. But anyway, so Napolitano, his last call to Trump, because Trump used to call him a lot because he would ask questions about things. Trump is curious. He does ask a lot of questions of his cabinets and stuff, and that's healthy. So you can come to a decision. Nobody does that in the other side right now. It's like you say, it's a script. Whoever's writing it, this is what you're going to say, this is what you're going to do. That at least, with all the faults of Trump, it's not happening in his populist movement, which is also freaking out the Republican rhinos. But they ought to go along with him for now. So he calls Trump. It's just a few days before the 20th, and he's no longer president. And he was calling because a lot because Trump was going to pardon people, and he was getting counsel from Judge Napolitano, or trying to question about this and that about people that he was going to pardon. And then suddenly, at a certain point, because he sounded like he was down, Trump was, and in New York, Napolitano said, "How you doing?" And he says, "Well, not really good, not really good." And then Napolitano said he went on a tangent where he talked about the voting fraud and all the things that happened in accounts and all that. And then suddenly Napolitano says, "Hey, you promised something that you didn't do." "What? What? Tell me, what is it?" Trump was like, What did I forget?" He says, "You promised me and others that you were going to unlock all the secrets
yeah,
about the Kennedy assassination." Well, but he said before, he said, "Well, whatever, I'll do it for you, whatever." And he said assassination, and he said, "Judge, if you saw what the security agencies showed me, um, you wouldn't have released anything." And so, what did they show you? What happened? He said, "Well, I'll tell you." He says, "Next time someday we're on the phone," and then he raised his voice, "and they're not 16 people or more. listening to this conversation. Trump went back to his normal voice. I'll tell you. And then Jeffrey Sachs was listening to his, oh my God, he was saying, he talked about, this reminds me of something someone said after the Kennedy assassination, that ever since his assassination, presidents have only been de facto presidents. In some degree or other, the executive branch lost its powers to the surveillance state. And I'm just looking at some interesting stuff that's coming out about Watergate, to what extent Watergate was used to take Nixon out. Because like him or hate him, Nixon was also rebellious. He was also trying to be his own man. It's kind of ironic that he was perhaps politically assassinated. He helped it along. He said, my biggest mistake is that I always believed in loyalty, and I wanted to defend the people who work for me, when really he just dug himself into a hole. But I mean, it's a funny thing about Nixon. God, he'd be a Democrat right now. He'd be running for the Democratic Party when he'd be running for the Republican Party. He did some great things. He was a checkered character. I mean, his trilateral diplomacy was brilliant. The way he played off the Soviet Union against a isolated China. The Soviets had isolated from the world, and the communist world, the second world. And because of in 69, the beginning of his first term, Russia almost went to nuclear war with China. The Chinese had lit their first atomic bomb in 1965, and they're starting to build bombs. And so it was a serious Politburo meeting saying, well, we got this border crisis on Siberia. That's the Russians call it Siberia. We call it Siberia, like Iran. And so they were deciding, we'll do a surgical nuclear strike, take out China's industries, turn it into it'd be a major thermonuclear war. It's interesting that Jean Dixon, a real psychic, a real prophet, she saw that coming. You know that she was also privately consulting FDR about his future, and Nixon, and and Kennedy, John Kennedy. She had, as it later turned out, was sometimes rolled in. Sometimes psychics and prophets are the guilty pleasure of leaders. I can say this, that without mentioning names, I did find out that I have some very surprising readers that I didn't know I had. And I'll just say that in some of the administrations past, they were in the West Wing. So I won't say any more. But so I've had a bit firsthand how, and not only that, I can say this. One of my readers of my predictions during the Iran-Iraq War, or the American occupation from 2003 to 2011, invasion, occupation of Iraq, sorry, was Ayatollah Sistani. He was the chief Ayatollah, Shia Muslim cleric in Iraq. In his offices, when I'd send my email bulletins of those days out, I'd get this bulletin back from southern Iraq with the letterhead of Sistani, and one of his secretaries wanted to thank me every time, automatically thank me for sending this stuff to their boss. And he was a Muslim cleric who practiced quietude, which means in the Muslim world, he was a very meditative man, rarely spoke. But when he spoke, everybody in the 2/3 of Iraq's population who are Shia Muslim, not Sunni Muslim, the majority Sunni Muslim of the Ummah, the community of believers in Islam. And so I found out that it impacted upon me how important it was for me I became aware, just looking at the readouts of who was reading me when I was looking at my ratings and stuff. And I got all these people from the Pentagon, all these people from, the source is the Pentagon, the source is even a US British base down in India, Indian Ocean. People were reading me there. So I realized, my God, and Al Qaeda is reading me. You know, I mean, the enemies of each other in conflicts were reading me. And I thought, wow, this is this unique thing that happens in cyberspace. I have a responsibility to paint the whole picture and be aware that combatants in both sides, including what's going on now, are reading me. And so my audience is all the human beings involved in conflicts. So and like I said, I was happy today to see one of my best sources, Anya Kay. She's one of my Polish sources, and most of my sources don't know me personally. I mean, it's just that I've been following her for a long time. She has a great way of there's this really good book that Scott Ritter and her did where they put all of their shows about the Ukrainian conflict together. I highly recommend you read it because Anya has a fantastic way of asking questions that are interesting and challenging that I have not seen in many people. So I was overjoyed actually to see that today she talked at length, this time with the actual prophecies of Edgar Casey about being the hope of the world, to all of her audience. And I thought, well, that's one good one for Edgar and his message about Russia being the hope of the world. That is being fulfilled now, because if it wasn't for the Russians' restraint, and it was the Russians that wanted to make peace, and they were pushed up against a wall to do it because we wouldn't let the Ukrainians remain neutral. That's all that had to happen in April 2020, just weeks into the war, when it was so close to ending. As I said an hour or so ago, the NATO kiboshed it, ordered Zelensky, their little puppet comic turned into a president, to drop all of that, and then this war went on, and then it really became a war. Rather than 40,000, Russia now has 700,000 inside Ukraine fighting this war, with another 400,000 in spear point offensive strike groups. Over a million. Ukraine has burned through 600,000 soldiers dead, 1 million injured. And this silly little Battle of the Bulge that happened outside of Sumy, not Belgorod. Interesting that I was talking about it, but it ended up being farther over to the west-northwest. But it's the same thing. It's the battle of the Bulge. And kind of if there's one good thing to come out of this tragedy and this great loss of life, men, and material, that the Ukrainians have just squandered their last reserves in this ridiculous publicity stunt. Thousands of guys dead, the best that they have left, because most of the people are on the front lines now. A lot of them are been there for 2 years, and they're burned out. You know, they used to have an army of them and a reserve of close to 1 million men. Now they probably have only really 150,000 effectives, and a whole lot of people are semi-trained. So, and it's unraveling. I mean, I think before the summer ends, there's a lot of things are going to be unraveling there. And then to get back to the first thing you wanted to talk about, there is that third front that America's hawks and neocons want to do, and that is to, in the face of our agreement since 1979 to acknowledge there's one China and Taiwan is Chinese, because they all are Chinese. They used to be a part of China. The Japanese took the island then called Formosa into their empire in a war of decision, a war of aggression, back in the 1800s, late 1800s, turned it into a colony, Formosa. But it was always a part of China for thousands of years with Chinese people. The people of Taiwan are Chinese. just like the people of Ukraine are Russians. There are three Russian Slavic Russians that are the core to the Kievan Rus. Kiev was the birthplace of the Slavic civilization. You have Kievan Russians, otherwise known as Ukrainians. You have Novgorodi Muscovy Russians, or as the Russians that are called just Russians, and you have the White Russians, Belarus Russians. But genetically, they're indistinguishable. They have, it's like Canadians and Americans. It's like English speaking people, same sources, same history, to use an analogy. And so this whole idea that Ukraine was some separate country has only come up of late, and it's been mostly perpetuated by the threat of fascism in Ukraine that survived its occupation of the Nazis as being the servants of Hitler are now back. And now that once again, just like in World War II, triggered by fascists becoming empowered politically in Italy and Germany, we have fascists rising again in power in Ukraine at the onset of the Third World War. So the Chinese, I might have said this before in other shows, but the Chinese are creating an idea, their way to take out carriers. They have these huge carrier killing ballistic missiles. But that was before the drone era happened. Now you can see a swarm of suicide drones, little itty bitty suicide drones. They can all come in, a few hundred. They can come in from all sides. And all they have to do is right into those great big openings to let air in the carrier hangars. And all those little guys have to do is spread out in the carrier, set afire fuel-filled jets near the bomb magazines. Little drones, bugs, can sink a carrier. It's just like, it used to be the day when Billy Mitchell had to break the illusion of, at the end of World War I, he actually went against command, but to just show these dumb people that the little biplane, give it a few several ton bombs, and they had a captured German dreadnought. And he flew over it. They were going to cancel it. He came in anyway, and he dropped the bombs, and with a couple bombs, sank a battleship. To show them, to have to rub it in their nose, these bureaucrats, that no, things have changed. We have to adapt to it. And unfortunately for us, he got drilled out of the army and all that eventually. Gary Cooper did a great movie on Billy Mitchell. Billy Mitchell was also a seer. He wrote about the future of carrier-borne, and the Japanese read it. The Japanese also had their problem with their battleship bureaucracies, building the huge Yamato and Musashi when they could have built 4 or 5 carriers out of that and won the war in the Pacific, but they didn't. But they were more open to carrier. The future was air power over the seas. The idea that 2 fleets would never see each other, but their planes would bomb each other. That happened in the Battle of the Coral Sea and Battle of Midway, first time. Big changes. World wars always create these big changes. And the people who win are the people who finally turn it around. Now, we did. We started, we got lucky in the beginning of the war, but actually we started creating Essex class carriers. I think we built 11 of them to start with. And by 1943, we had air superiority. Everybody was starting to learn that won this war, that air superiority is how you win. But people in World War I weren't even thinking of that. The best thing that ever flew that did anything for strategic or tactical use was some poor guy up without a parachute in a helium, not helium, the burning kind of stuff, balloon. So if it gets shot, it burns up. When they were getting high enough to see what was going on in the fronts. And, the biplanes were kind of a sideshow. They only started using them for strafing at the end, where they were actually attacking the infantry. So Billy Mitchell proved it, and he wrote in his book about it. He said the war would start with Pearl Harbor being attacked by the Japanese. He wrote that in the mid-1920s. And he's proven right. Fortunately, enough people were listening, and America did get into the war pretty well advanced in the concept of carriers, not poo-pooing it. And so the person who gets the new technology and adapts to it, the Russians are doing it, the Chinese are doing it. We are not. We're still looking at the world as if we're going to fight Afghanistan here. So these little colonial, imperial little wars, little war in Iraq, nasty one, but a little one. Like when America went into the Philippines and fought there for years, nasty war. But it's the Philippines, it's Afghanistan, it's Iraq. It's not Europe. It's not the Pacific theater. It's not the world. So the Russians have prepared for big war, and we are still fighting small. We have small reserves of weapons, because it's the people in the military industrial complex making money off of all this. They don't want us to build lots of millions of shells and have huge stockpiles and be able to expand in a twinkling of an eye our factories if we're in a big war to produce like the Russians are producing, because their military industrial complex is government owned with some private association, but their whole fundamental issue is we build things for purpose, defending Mother Russia. And there's profit, but it's secondary. Their weapons are purposeful. Our weapons are profitable and don't work. And we don't make enough of them because there would be less profits. I mean, the way in which the military American industrial complex has been exposed by the war in Ukraine is phenomenal. How it's just a big grift. And a lot of military industrial complex people are making billions, trillions, building stuff that's too complicated, so it breaks down a lot. So they have to can make more money in the life cycle of a F this or that, F-16. We're sending F-16s to Ukraine that if they make too tight a turn, the frame will break because they're like 30 years old with a new paint job with Ukrainian blue and yellow dots on them. It's we are not about function and purpose. We are about profit, and our weapons are rusting across Ukraine as testament with this, and the fact that we're literally stripping NATO and the United States' artillery reserves. And if we end this attack that happened out of the Sumy area, where the surprise attack by the GUR, which is not actually the main Ukrainian force, it's the special forces. This attack, I was listening to Udinov of the Chechens are fighting up there, Chechen Russians, and I was surprised to see this morning in his report, had a translation going on that he said, we're finding lots of Poles, lots of non-Ukrainians, a lot of like NATO people sheep dipped into Ukrainian uniforms. They're finding tons of them in that special attack, and almost all the equipment is German, the Martas, and I mean, we're this close to just being, oh, come on, stop pretending. We're fighting NATO. And the Russians already know that. They've known that since the beginning of this phase of the Ukrainian civil war that's become international. And so it's potentially likely that when things unravel, there will be a strong desire of NATO a temptation to go direct into a clash with the Russians. And that's when it gets very, very dangerous, because they are going in without enough weapons. They've given them all to the Ukrainians to destroy. And what will soon happen is, because NATO is not ready for big war with the big boys in the battlefields that haven't been raging since World War II in Europe. They're going to walk in there, and they're probably not going to last a few days in the sustained combat. Then what do you have as an option left? When your conventional forces are not purpose-based, not working, not enough, and you've got even your armed forces reducing their size and taking ships out of the Navy and taking divisions out of on the land because you're not getting enough draftees or volunteers to volunteer. You're getting deficits. So our armies are shrinking in NATO. And what then do you have left to fight with? Tactical nuclear weapons. How I have lived almost 70 years, and I grew up in a world where people thought it unthinkable to drop nuclear weapons. We all, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, we all were terrified about what was going on. And all we had were transistor radios and listening to Walter Cronkite for 30 minutes every night, weeknight. But we were watching, and mother, father, my brother, and me were kids. Everybody was watching it. We got scared. Your press is with so much more elaborate ability to talk to people. It's not giving you the perspective of how close we are to thermonuclear war, for this third world war to turn into a thermonuclear war. And we're coming to those points where crises can happen. You got a bunch of people on script that aren't leaders, cannot think, running our country. What are they going to do? And they're not going to tell you. People who are telling you stuff like this are being silenced. So remember these things I say, because who knows? I may not be able to come on these shows. I've already apparently been ghosted from Coast to Coast AM after almost 30 years being on that show as one of its major guests. All I got is crickets about that. They don't have the courage to say, we don't want you on anymore. You're too dangerous for us. Man up. At least be a man and tell me you're fired. But just, John, who? Well, cowards. So, but that's their problem. I still love them. You know, to err is human. To blame it on somebody else is even more human. You know? So, and who knows? The pressure is going to be so big for me to do every 4 years, my presidential predictions live on George Nuri's Coast to Coast in October, and then on election night. I mean, I think it's been 2 or 3 election cycles where I have been, the big guest on election night for Coast to Coast AM. I'm still hoping that there'll be enough people who'll be writing them saying, where is Hogue? What's going on? And have me on the show. If not, I'll do it on your show.
It sounds good, actually.
Yeah.
I don't know what the last election cycle I did do a live show.
Mm.
And the way I did it is that in the background, I was also looking at the futures market. So the Asian
Mm.
session was open, and I was able to watch how the trading was happening in real time when the polls were closing.
Oh, that's
And
good.
I remember,
Yeah.
so I looked at it from and I tried to be humorous, but I also tried, I voted for Trump
Mm.
the last cycle. And, I tried to show how the international markets were looking at this, how our futures market potentially would open up in the New York session in the morning. And Trump looked like he won before I went to bed. And when I woke up, it was like a totally different world.
Well, suddenly
I mean,
all these trucks was full of ballots that, oh, we found these other ballots. I mean, there's a lot of weird stuff going on, and I predicted this would happen from looking at the start. I said on George Noory, I said, I'm not so sure we'll have it. This might be the first truly failing election, I don't know if I'll be able to do my since 68, I do popular vote. I tune into the people and I give the percentage difference between who won the popular and who didn't.
yeah.
And the last time I could actually corroborate it was the 2% that Hillary had over Trump, even though he won the Electoral College. But I vote for the person who wins the people's majority choice. That doesn't mean they become the president. And I also, it was a strange thing in 2016 when I wrote my most accurate book of forecasting, not expecting to even write it. I wrote it and published it on the winter solstice of 2015, a few weeks, a month, 6 weeks before the primaries started. But in that book, I said that Trump had a real chance if he survived through all the hoops in the Republican Party and all the stuff they do there. If he was actually the candidate on that election night, he had the best stars I'd ever seen since 1968 of pulling a surprise. But I still said Hillary Clinton's going to win the popular vote. Now, I had all these people who heard the win, didn't hear me qualify it, even though I did. And they were, oh, you said she would win. Well, she did win the popular vote. That's what I do. I don't do electoral college.
But right. This is an example of the average lower IQ in the United
Yep.
States. They're not paying attention to everything.
No, no,
And
literally.
yeah,
I mean, I've watched that. I watch it sometimes. The short-term memory loss. I mean, you were right when you said about how the pineal or something. It's that. What is that thing that kind of looks like a? It's in the brain.
well,
It's
the hippocampus.
hippocampus. Yeah, yeah, hippocampus. Yeah. Um, it is shrinking. And I see the effects as somebody who did not, even back in the 90s, people used to use a TV as a babysitter, even with really small children. I mean, I wasn't allowed to just sit there watching TV like that as a 2 or 3 year old. Can't understand it. Just place them in front of the kids going, oh, that's rewiring the brain in a different way. So a lot of things have changed, and the thing that I'm amazed how over the years I've had people criticize my articles as with great authority, and it's clear they only read the title because I set the trap.
Mhm.
And I've done this hundreds of times where people really come down on my and I'm going, my God, man, I know for a fact you never read the article,
Exactly. And
read
here,
the title.
some literature and even Kabbalistic texts
Hmm.
will frame something that takes literally 20 pages to understand the argument, because
Yeah,
they may actually, in the first 10 pages, they may actually frame the argument in a way and then they refute it in the last 10,
yeah,
or
yeah,
vice versa. And
right.
so if someone doesn't study all the pages, they have no idea. They just take one page and they go, this is what they said.
Yeah,
Well,
Kabbalism, you cannot
you
do
take it
that.
out. Yeah, exactly. If you take it
Yeah,
out of context, you miss the whole point
yeah,
of the argument.
yeah. I mean, yeah, I mean, I have contacts in America, Kabbalists who are rabbis, a rabbi who also talks with the main circle of Kabbalists in Jerusalem. And they are not for what's going on with Netanyahu and the Zionists. They are not Zionists. They see this actually as an abomination.
Mhm.
That is this Israel was not the Israel that was supposed to show up. And before I forget about it, because tomorrow is a very important day, it's Tisha. I'm probably mispronouncing it.
Teshuvah.
Yeah, yeah, the ninth of of the month, which is in the lunar calendar, and the Hebrew calendar is different, but it shows up in different dates. It's in the 12th tomorrow. And, for people who don't know, in a nutshell, it's a remarkable situation in prophecy that this date has seen more catastrophes across thousands of years of the story of the Hebrew people. So much so that it is one of the most important fasting days at the opening of the Hebrew New Year, I believe. Please correct me if I'm wrong. But just to give you an example, what I did, there are so many that if you take the day after or the day before, that's also very plausible. But what I did is I said there's many other things, like for instance, Torquemada throwing out all the Jews from Spain in 1492, I think was on the 10th of that month, not the 9th in the Hebrew calendar. So I make that point. There's many other things that happen close to enough that really it qualifies. But just to be specific about the 9th in the Hebrew calendar for this month, in the Hebrew calendar, you have both sackings of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temples on the 9th. You had it with the Temple of Solomon being razed to the ground, and the survivors of Jerusalem and Judea were being sent into the Babylonian captivity of Nebuchadnezzar. That all started on the 9th. And then centuries later, in 70 AD, at the end of the siege of Jerusalem by Titus and the Roman legions, the temple of Herod was razed to the ground. Jerusalem was razed to the ground. Those who did not die, which they estimated was around 1 million people in the insurrection, were made slaves, who were caught. And that was the beginning, the first step of what was the diaspora. And then in AD 135, the rebellion that happened then that killed 500,000 more Jews. That was the second big step that pretty much finished the spreading of Jews out of the homeland into the diaspora. That also happened on the 9th of this month we're talking about in the Hebrew calendar. The official order of the thing that should never be named the final solution in the Holocaust, the orders were delivered to Himmler and the SS to begin the culling of the Jewish race on the 9th of this month.
I didn't know.
1942.
Wow.
After Wannsee, Mad Lake Conference, appropriately named Wannsee, Crazy Lake. And then Treblinka on this 9th in 1942 began to get the first of what would be all of the Jews living in the Warsaw Ghetto on trains to Treblinka to be gassed. And there's more. I mean, the English in I don't remember, it was in the 1200s on the 9th, threw all the Jews out of England. Like I said, on the 10th, the Spanish Inquisition under Torquemada threw all the Jews out of Spain, which is the huge diaspora of Jews. Actually, Nostradamus was involved in the first purge that happened in the end of the 1300s. His family went to Carcassonne and Avignon and Provence in that first one. But this was the one at the end of the following century, 100 years later, in around 1492, which most people know of, the Sephardic cast out. 9th. It's just a day off. That doesn't matter. I mean, 9th, 10th, it doesn't matter. It's and there were so many others. I just said, look, I can't. My articles are getting big enough as it is with details. So I just
It was
wanted.
1290. It was 1290.
Yeah, 1290. Yes. Yeah, and I mean, I wasn't aware of that. I deal with a lot of different prophetic tales, but there's always something that comes up that really surprises me. And so the importance of this is what's about to erupt potentially with a widening of the war, a war with Iran striking Israel, and this time striking them hard. I hear now the word is that it's still on. The Iranians are taking their time like they did before. You know, April Fool's Day was when the Israelis assassinated and a bunch of people in the embassy of Damascus on Iranian territory, which all embassies are territory of the nation that they stand for. And that's always been Iran's statement. And if they thought the technicality of it not being Iran proper, well, Netanyahu, I think, was trying to get a war. He tried that one out, and then the Iranians did as they said they'd always do. If you attack our land, we will fight a war with you. We don't want to, but stop this. So they made a gesture. They showed that their missiles could reach and touch things, and they weren't the best missiles. A lot of them just fell out of the sky because they were just throwing all their junk at Israel. But they touched things. They hit the air bases. This time it'll be with their modern missiles, and there's going to be a lot of damage and serious damage. You know, Haifa could be knocked out. The ammonium nitrate reserves that are in tanks next to the harbor could go up like Lebanon if they wanted to do that. I don't think they'd want to do that because that would probably launch a thermonuclear war, but they could. Pakistan has said it would launch on Israel if Israel launched on Iran nukes. They wouldn't need many because Israel's a small country. It's taking a lot of time for the Iranians because they're also preparing to defend. And what has happened, as per the asymmetrical war that Putin said, look, if you NATO people are going to hide behind the Ukrainians all these years, killing Russian civilians deep inside Russia with your American-built things, we are not going to attack you directly. We are going to wage asymmetric war in response. That means if you're going to arm these people to hurt Russians, we'll arm your enemies to hurt you. So spelling it out rationally and clearly, we don't want to go here. You people are going here, and now we're going to respond to this outrage. So Putin started, and the Russian Federation started signing alliances with Iran and military weapons trades alliances. I mean, the Iranians have been giving the Iran drones to the Russians, and they have built their own versions of it. So the Iranians have already been helping the Russians in their war. And now jet after jet's coming into Tehran, large transport jets. They're probably sending them the S-400s that the Russians pledged to give them. Now they're rushing them in. I would imagine, I don't know, it's just a sense I have, that I'm sure that since all that was in the works for the last year or so, I would not be surprised if Iranian soldiers are being trained in Russia to use those for a year now. It's not a fact, I know, it's just a sense. It'll be proved by what happens, but I would also say that there will be Russians, I mean, as there are Americans and Britons and Germans and other people manning the weapons inside Ukraine, a lot of them dying by the hundreds that you're not hearing about, especially a lot of French and Poles. Thousands have died. It looks like 1,000 more died in this recent farce, this Battle of the Bulge from Sumy region. Well, the Russians are going to be overseeing the defense of those things with their new crews of Iranians, and the S-400 is the best anti-missile system, anti-jet in the world. Heads and shoulders. In fact, our strategy has never been to defend our skies. We've always thought overwhelming numbers. We have the biggest air forces. So that's still something America and NATO, but especially America. We have the two largest air forces on the planet Earth are the USAF and the Naval Air Force. They're American air forces. they're Russians have 700 jets. They have several thousand. So, I mean, you could potentially see a major Battle of Britain-like thing where the Americans try to use their air power to attack Russians if the Russians cross over the Dnieper, and it starts conventional. Although hundreds of those jets are nuclear capable, so and the Russians won't know if they have nuclear bombs on them. So the Russians, if that happens, the Russians will launch on all the airstrips in NATO that launch them and destroy them. And the other thing is that the strength of America, they might have the numbers, but the Russians have the defense anti-missile, anti-jet systems that are the best in the world, and we're going to lose a lot of jets. So then what do you do? Now you've lost the one thing you have. The only thing you have left then is the carriers, and now swarms of drones are taking them out before Taiwan and before. What do you do then? You go to the nuclear option. It's really a bad situation when your options is just that, because there's no winning that. Can't win a nuclear war. As much as these fools in Washington try to talk themselves into winning thermonuclear war, you don't win it. The nuclear weapon is a deterrent. Its success as a function in war is that no one ever dares use them. If you use them, you've lost everything. Like no war has lost before. So anyway, back to this idea of this date. I was thinking, well, maybe the Iranians might, because they were so mindful of the Sabbath on the 13th of April, they didn't, all those drones and all those kamikaze drones and the missiles didn't start hitting Israel until after sundown on the Sabbath. And I thought, oh, okay. Well, as in the Middle East, people are aware of the different traditions and things of different religions. I mean, probably most Americans wouldn't even know that the Sabbath ends at sunset, but if they weren't Jewish. But so I start to think. I said, are the Iranians going to strike tomorrow at the time that we're doing this on Sunday, the 11th? Would they strike? I don't think. I hope this 9th is not going to be used, or the 10th, or the 11th of the Hebrew calendar. I think the Iranians are going to take their time because they plan to defend themselves as well as attack. And I think I'm hearing words that the Iranians are saying their attack will last for 4 days and 4 nights, nonstop, when it happens. To give an instant, because what's going to happen is they're still doing it lenient. It's just a much more larger point. Like first they showed the Israelis, we can touch you. This time they're going to be doing it day and night for 4 days and nights, perhaps. And then they can say, and you're going to almost, by the time we stop, exhaust your Iron Dome, exhaust your anti-missile systems, and the Americans will run out of their missiles. You got all these American planes that have to taxi over this airspace and off the shore, and that means you got all these tankers. Very complicated thing that the American naval and U.S. Air Force has to do. They're probably going to play it in such a way with some of the missiles coming out of Iraq, some of them out of Yemen. That's also taking time. They're getting missiles there too. So the missiles are going to be coming in all different directions at all different times, and they're going to try to do it so it really screws up the whole fueling cycle. And then a lot of the jets are not actually shooting at anything. And there'll probably be a whole ton of, they have tens of thousands of these little drones that can fly in, and they will probably, I mean, what people don't understand is in the 13th, everybody says, oh, they shot down all the drones. They were useless. No, they weren't. They were all getting intelligence. They were all feeding back intelligence of what the Israeli defense systems were capable of doing. That's why they were there. And before they got all knocked out of the sky, they gave Iran an immense amount of intel about the Israeli capabilities, which will now be shown, if I'm right about this, on what the Iranians do next. So, what they're hoping is that, the Israelis are going to see that their missile defense systems can be easily exhausted in a few days. So stop fighting and start talking. But Netanyahu is mad. He's lost it. He's in command, but he's now thinking magically. Maybe I think Ben-Gvir and Smolich and those guys have converted him into a full-blown Zionist supremacist. Biblically, I mean, we're talking about magical thinking and biblical interpretations of apocalyptic messianic stuff that I have never seen Israeli leadership this far gone into, just like Christian Zionists in the United States, where, arguably misinterpreting a lot of the book of Revelation into a setup of a tribulation that's not even mentioned in the Revelation. It's just a few lines that people vaguely put together. And in my book, Messiahs, I debunk that whole thing. There's not. So the 7 years tribulation, all this is all like gospel Bible stuff for Christian Zionists. But it's really not. It's not in the book of Revelation. It's made up of interpretation upon interpretation, and it's become dogma. The rapture. There's just a few lines that are so vague that you have to just be force-fed to believe it's a certain way in your Sunday school thing and just believe and have faith in it. But the rapture, there's just a few vague phrases in it. I think it'd be pretty big to see 114,000 people go up in the sky and disappear all around the earth. It's not really there in the book of Revelation. It's made up. And so, just as I've watched things being made up in Islamic doomsday prophecies, last days prophecies, as well as Judaic, um, um, those people are running the show in Israel right now. These people are thinking Emmanuel is going to come back. That it's not just the Christians that are trying to believe that Israel's going to do this. Now it's the Israeli Zionists themselves who are starting to talk like this. Right? And Netanyahu is thinking Amalek, and Arabs and Iranians are the Amalek, they're animals. A lot of mad stuff going on here. A lot of insane, psychopathic people with nukes. Israel has them. So does Pakistan. So I always, if I remember, come back to this important point. We're in an experiment. And this is a very mystical thing I'm going to talk about. Something I've been around personally. I've been at the feet of one of the figures I claim was an enlightened man. One of the three figures in the 20th century that brought up this ancient idea that hastens back to India in 500 BC. And I've said it before, but I'll say it again because it's very important, because there is an idea that happened when Buddha, Mahavira, and three other Keshkambal and two other people were all walking around for 10 years, like great enlightened masters, walking and teaching in the kingdoms of India. And in that decade, the pundits of different kingdoms, they all corresponded with each other, trying to find out why there was so much peace. Why were the castes in harmony? Why were there no wars in that decade? They call it the decade of grace, around 500 BC. Buddha was the youngest. Mahavir of the Jains was the eldest. And for 10 years, they all lived. They never met each other, but they were teaching multitudes of people how to be meditative, how to be loving, how to be a light unto themselves. And it seemed to impact all the people that weren't doing that. It's sort of, you always wonder why in India people support sadhus and swamis, and if they need to have food, they're given. It's probably because of days like that decade of grace, a half 2,500 years ago, is that there's a memory that we don't understand why these people who are trying to find nirvana are important to our community, but there's some understanding that what they're doing impacts all people, whether they're seeking enlightenment or not. That's the theory. So when the 20th century erupted and forced a lot of mystics, great mystics of the time, to consider this, Jiddu Krishnamurti, who I met 3 times, Gurdjieff, who died in 1949, so I never met him, and my own master, Osho, who I was with for 10 years before he died. And I guarded, one of the guard detailed the guard over his ashes when they were burning day and night. Before we took the ashes out and put it in the samadhi, we were guarding on the 4 corners of the burning ghat. Same burning ghat that 10 years earlier I started my life as a sannyasin in my orange robes, meditating before burning bodies to face death. What's death like? And so, which is a common tantric meditation in India. So nobody had a problem with me sitting there. In fact, as many people were being carted in to be burnt, some of the people saw me in my orange robes and they say, "Swamiji, would you come and bless our friend?" And I'd get up, and it was a Buddhist family, and I'd bless them and I'd go back to my burning. Next day, I would set 3 hours, I would sit and position myself so, because the bodies didn't burn that well, there was a lot of the skeleton remaining. So I would sit myself in such a way that I would be looking right at the darkest corner inside a skull eye socket and meditate upon that unblinking for 3 hours. Just lightly, slightly, my eyes open, and watch my breath and go into the face of death, a skeletal death. And then on the 3rd day, I came at the evening and I sat at the same pit that had been purified with milk and swept and clean, with no ashes in it, just the empty space. And then I watched that. And then 10 years later, just so happened that I was just happened to be on the guard details. I was a guard a lot, and I hadn't been a guard for a long time, but I was just grabbed to do it. And so I was sitting the morning of the 3rd from 3 a.m. till 6 to be there when the ashes were recovered right in front of me of Osho. So Gurdjieff had thought that all that was needed was just 100 more people to become fully enlightened than the average. Of course, he was saying it when the population was lower. Jiddu Krishnamurti was talking about being 10 to 25 or 5. Osho said 200. I think 200 is probably more realistic given the population. The average has to increase to balance it out. And this is an important thing to remember. Unconsciousness is quantity. That's why mobs are the most unconscious gathering of human beings. The mob mind takes over and people do things that they'd never do as individuals. So quantity is the quality of unconsciousness. Consciousness is like light. One little candle with all the darkness of the universe before it cannot be snuffed out. Consciousness has quality that counterbalances quantity. So the thing that's needed is some grace space of 200 more people becoming enlightened in the world. And if this experiment works, because we've never been in human history in a situation like this, where can this grace that happened in India in 500 BC, can it actually do the following things? And so this is what I want you all to be watching carefully in the coming few years. That if we come so close to destroying ourselves in ways that was never imagined back in 62, and yet we don't at the last minute cross the line of doom. In all the many which ways it's coming in the next few years. No matter how hard the human race unconsciously tries to destroy itself, it doesn't achieve it. I don't know how that's possible. But if the hand of madness is stayed right at the moment when it should not be, again and again, then the 200 are here. And we will get through this terrible time. That will prove that the 200 experiment has worked.
We'll probably have to leave it at that. It's almost been 3 hours.
We almost
So
got through half of Act 3 of Die Valkyrie without the Valkyries.
So I just want to remind the audience, please click the link in the description of this video and all the videos I have done with John. That link will take you to his website. You can purchase his periodicals, and you can also get a reading. And hopefully when we do the next show, this one I think is 18. Yeah, this
Right
one's
around the convention.
yeah. So
It's
yeah,
right before the convention, the night before, Sunday.
the night before. Okay.
Very interesting time it will be.
Yeah, definitely. But I also want to maybe dive in a little bit about the readings, the next show, so people understand what the readings are and a little bit more about your periodical. But please click the link in the description. That will take you to John's website, and please sign up for his periodical and readings. Okay. So, John, say goodbye to everybody.
Goodbye to everybody. And I love you.
All right, let me stop the recording here.